coming tonight. And I want to thank Bill and Jackie for inviting me to come back. I was here a few months ago, and I did a discussion about Baroque performance practice on period and modern instruments. And I brought all my violins, which is 2, and a bunch of bows, and I've brought them again. And you'll meet Stephanie in a minute, and she's brought all of her cellos as well.
Actually, I left one at home. I have one with 5 strings. I left that one at home.
So she only has 2 of her cellos with her. So in part 1, I talked a lot about performing Baroque music, both on period instruments, and how then we can go and play the same kind of feeling and character with modern instruments. And I went kind of back and forth. And I went through a lot of dances, because the Baroque dances really, the kind of fundamental form that supports a lot of Baroque forms and a Baroque expression. And I got up to the chaconne. So I left off at the chaconne, and Bill and Jackie said, well, come back and resume it for part 2. So here we are starting at the chaconne. And I also, the chaconne is a really classic Baroque dance. And when violinists talk about the chaconne, they always think immediately of the grand monumental work for solo violin by J.S. Bach. And in a way, for contemporary audiences and for all of us, as for me certainly growing up as a violinist, the chaconne was defined by that big piece. It's the centerpiece of the second partita of Bach's collection. He wrote 6 sonatas, 3 sonatas and 3 partitas for solo violin. So that's really the centerpiece, and it's a monumental work for the violin. So as violinists, we tend to think of it as the treble line, because that's what violinists do. We always sing a little song on top. But in truth, the essence of that piece comes from the bass line. So to really demonstrate the chaconne, I really needed someone to play the bass line for me. So it was a perfect excuse to invite my friend and colleague, Stephanie Vial. And I'm just delighted that she could come join you, and you're going to be fascinated by what she has to tell you. So, just to give you a little background, Stephanie and I both went to Cornell. We both have doctorates in historical performance practice, 18th century historical performance practice. And we've been performing and teaching together for, I think it's 20 years. It's pretty close to 20 years now. And while we perform in our ensemble with period instruments, one of our passions has been trying to learn how to translate the language of Baroque expression to modern instruments. And so in part 1, I looked a lot at how the same music can be played on both instruments, and we find out that the differences in the way a piece sounds is not only about the equipment that we use, but in my opinion, is even more importantly about the interpretive and expressive choices we make. So, getting back to the chaconne, what is the chaconne? And I'm going to ask Stephanie to talk about it. So.
Right, so we think of the chaconne as instrumentalists as a virtuoso piece. Which it is, and it's long and involves lots of practicing. But it has this history in dance, and in opera, it would often close an act, or perhaps the entire opera. And it's a lavish affair with everybody on stage, and kind of hypnotic. And part of the reason that is because it has a ground bass. So it's essentially the same thing over and over again. It's 8 bars that get repeated over and over again with variation, and each variation has a new affect. Most importantly, it's in triple meter, and we'll talk about it a little bit. It shares a little bit with the sarabande. The sarabande is a more slow and stately dance, and here the sense of flow is really exaggerated in the chaconne.
And so we're going to play a little bit of the piece called The Grand Dance by Pursle. It was the finale of his opera King Arthur. And if this had been a French Baroque opera, and I think I talked about this a little bit last time, this would have been the end, and the entire court would have been a little woozy from their recreational indulgences. And there's actually quite a lot of accounts of the entire court swaying and swooning along with this kind of hypnotic dance. So we're going to play a bit of The Grand Dance by Pursle. And by the way, so we're using our period instruments now. We will go back and forth, and just to warn you, they are a half step apart. So we'll try and remember to establish the new tonality when we pick up the new instruments to get your ears adjusted. So this is... Actually, should we...
But of course, that's not where it ends. It goes on and on and on. It goes into a wonderful minor section, and then when you come out of it and this major, F major comes back, it's just the most joyous thing you've ever heard. So let's talk a little bit about what's on the page. This, of course, is part of historical performance practice, which is figuring out what does the notation mean. Of course, it's always imprecise, and it only tells us so much. So if we're looking at bar 2, I know they don't have the parts. I was just realizing that myself.
Okay, we'll have to describe them to you.
So in bar 2. Play what's
okay, so in bar 2, I have 6 straight what we call eighth notes. And if I had seen just bar 2 and I didn't see it in context and didn't know who wrote it or when it was written, I would have many options. I could think of it and I would say, oh, maybe it's this. Or I could play. That's both in 3. I'm playing the correct notes and the correct rhythm and everything. But then if somebody said, oh, it's Pursle, oh, I know it's 18th century, and I talked a bit in the last part about this thing that we can do with these instruments, which is unusual, which I call separate bow legato. And that linear notes like that are very melodic. So I see this is probably smooth. But I'm going to play the first 2 bars again, and let's see if I played it that way. So here's the first 2 bars. So what I did, of course, is I did not play them straight. And that, I did refer to that before, that is that inégal. And it's this swung motion of eighth notes, which is not notated on the page. There is absolutely no indication that you're supposed to do that. Pursle would have expected that his musicians would have understood at that moment that this was the thing to do at that place. In the same way a jazz player would know to do that from looking at his notation. Now what's really interesting, you can't see this, but in bar 6, actually it's written with dotted rhythms. So that is a notation where it has long, short. And again, if I was looking at that, didn't know who wrote this, I would say, well, maybe it's this. Or maybe it would be... But again, and I talked about this before, it turns out that that dotted rhythm is not swung like I played the other measure. It's this very light, sparkly kind of thing that we don't really play dotted rhythms in this way in contemporary music, but it's just... And I think I remember last time I showed you in a Veracini sonata where he does that for an entire movement practically. So that's the theme. So should we play that theme?
Yeah, let's play that theme.
So we're just going to play the theme, and then we're going to walk you through the variations, and you see how the characters change. So...
So that's a fairly lush variation, and there was a little bit of dotted rhythms, but now the dotted rhythms really take over, and to accommodate that, I'm going to play a little differently as well.
And notice, if you had the music, you'd see that she just keeps playing the same thing over and over again. On the page, it looks identical.
It's on the screen.
It's on the screen. For our audience here, we don't have.
Right.
They unfortunately don't have it. But for you on the screen, you can see that all of a sudden,
Right.
dump, ba-dum.
So now here's the first variation.
Now all of a sudden it starts to get a little bit chromatic, and there's tension and dissonance, and so we're going to dig a little deeper and find something else.
And also think about the second beat.
And at this point, the cello actually drops out, and we have just the viola playing the continuo line. And the second violin has these wonderful dotted rhythms.
And I don't have another violin to play the first violin, so you have to remember the melody and sing it in your head while I'm doing this. The reason we do this demonstration is that the fact is she plays very differently every time, and that helps define the character. And none of this is on the page. This is all part of that unnotated expression.
And it makes it more interesting for me as well.
Yeah.
I'm gonna pass this around so you can all have a look at it since we're done with it. What's interesting is that opening rhythm of quarter, dotted quarter, eighth is also a really common rhythm in the sarabande, and it's that elongated special second beat that really creates the flow. And we are going to see the very same rhythm in Bach's chaconne.
So this is the famous Bach chaconne that I was referring to for solo violin. And this is the manuscript, which we never really found until about 1902. But there were fair copies of it around in the 19th century, probably copied possibly first by Bach's wife, Anna Magdalena, and copied by students, and copies and copies and copies. So this thing was floating around throughout the 19th century. Then the manuscript appeared in 1902, and then there was just this explosion of editions. And all these great violinists were trying to interpret this music because it doesn't look very violinistic on this page. You can't see it, but what Bach has written is he has looks like sustained four-note chords. And the violin doesn't really, it's not a guitar. So we don't think of sustaining four notes at this time. And so when they saw this in the end of the 19th century, they thought, well, there's something wrong with it. We have to reinterpret it. And so what I'm going to do is play. In fact, here, I'm not going to use this because I have another copy of it. So I'm going to play. There is, as far as I know, there's at least 75 extant editions of this music, and that's of all 6 sonatas by just 75 different violinists, and they've gone through every phrase and put a lot of information on the page. What they think are information of how to play, execution, how to play this music so it works, to reinterpret it. So the first one I'm going to play, I'm going to give you a couple of 19th century example, 20th century, late 19th and 1/20th, and then I'm going to go and play this game. I did the same thing last time. I'm going to go back to my Baroque violin and then finish with my modern. So you're going to hear this opening phrase 4 times.
And for those of you online, you get the advantage of seeing the music as she plays it, but we will pass it along to our in-person audience after we finish.
So the first one I'm going to play is by a guy named Mr. Helmsberger. It's about 1890. So all he knew about Bach was that he was an organist. So in his mind, those things must have implied huge full chords. So this was in about 1890, was the most popular version. This is what everybody played. I'm just going to play the opening here. So to get your ears ready. So this is what Mr. Helmsberger thought this music should be. Is that these editions, which appear peppered starting kind of in the late 19th century and all through the 20th, they're all incredibly different. If I was to sit here for 2 hours, I could play, and everyone sounds very different. And what they are mirrors of the living performance practice of the time. They say more about the style of the way string playing was at the time the edition was made than they do about Bach. Now, there's one caveat about this. And this is a problem when you talk about Bach, and why Bach is so difficult to really understand performance practice, because he's just too damn good. The problem is the notes on the page, minus anything, are so good you can play them on spoons. You can bang. If you get those pitches out, it sounds like music. And in a way, that's why. I mean, he was obviously this genius that there's no words to describe how great he was, but because of this fact that it's so fundamentally well written, it survived basically all these hundreds of thousands of really diverse translations. Whereas the little Pursle we played before, which I think is Pursle's an amazing composer, but it does not survive that kind of playing. It just really doesn't sound like music when you do that. So that's just this little caveat. So that was Mr. Helmsberger, and I'm going to pass this around. That's the first example on this sheet. Then I'm going to go by the middle of the 20th century. Suddenly we started to get people started to get interested in period instruments and this historical movement. And maybe it was different. Maybe our understanding, they understood about the instruments being different. And then there were a lot of scholars. And the entire early music movement, don't you think we kind of sit on the shoulders of out of their work? But the first scholars were not virtuoso players. They were readers, and we owe them a great service. So there was a scholar in the 50s named Mr. Champagne, and he started to discover a little bit about these Baroque dances, kind of the things we've been talking about. And he looked at this thing and said, oh, it's a Baroque dance. Oh, it should be a quick dance. And at that time, the performance practice, people thought that dotted rhythm I'm talking about, everybody loved what we call overdotting. So if there was a dotted rhythm, we'd overdot it. And you've all heard people talk about French overture style, and that's what that overdotted. So he went, and he's got an addition here, and I'm going to try and play it. He gave me a very quick metronome marking, and I think he thought it was a high step or something. Anyway, so this is what he tells me to play. It's in the 50s, and this is tricky. I'm going to try and do this. All right, so. So we get things like that, which, I think is very interesting. I don't really think Bach would recognize. Bach probably would have preferred Mr. Hansberger's. But, again, it was very important. So now, here's some more. I'm going to let you have this one. I'm not going to play all 70 different editors. What we're going to do is I'm going to ask Stephanie's help, and we're going to go back to try and figure out how to play the Bach original one. And I want to use my period violin, and we're going to take what we've learned about the chaconne, take it apart a little bit, and see if I come up with a different version. So the first thing we're doing, I can even hold this up so you can see. So what we've done is we've separated the bass and treble line out. Stephanie is playing the bass line, which are the bottom notes of those chords I played. And I'm going to play just the top notes of those chords, and it turns out it sounds like this. So that's recognizable. It feels a little bit more like the Pursle. So Steph has a little exercise for us now.
Right, so she separated the bass line from the treble so that you can really hear that that's what's repeating. And it's really helpful for the violinist to do that, to then, when they think about all the other variations, to try and find that bass line so that you don't lose it. But most importantly, I think it's the metrical sense that the bass line gives you. Now, you remember that the Pursle had a really strong downbeat, but the violin had exactly the same rhythms above it, except that they didn't have the downbeat. So this starts on an upbeat. And I've actually, when we separated the bass line out, I put the first beat there, but I put it in parentheses because it's not really there, but you fundamentally have to feel it. And in order to understand, this is sort of complicated, but to understand this, we're going to play this with sort of late 19th century phrasing. More like the early examples of the Bach chaconne that Liz played, so that everything is a pickup to the downbeat, and then a new start, a pickup to the downbeat. So we're going to play it like that so you can really hear that. But if we want to have that sense of chaconne that Pursle had, and that I think is really here, we really have to feel that downbeat and feel every bar with the downbeat giving us a beginning. In a lot of the phrases, there's this sense that there's an ending and a beginning at the same time.
And what this really is in a way, is in a simple way, trying to describe this very big difference between 18th and 19th century expression. In the 19th century, we think about Mahler and long lines and getting to the end, and the goal is the cadence. Whereas here, we're thinking with these dance steps, things are coming not towards the downbeat, but from the downbeat. and things are more constructed a little bit more rhetorically, which we'll get back to.
And long lines, just in a different way.
Lines.
Basically, everything is backwards.
Yeah.
So, here we go.
So now you're going to play the downbeat, right? Okay, so there's my chaconne frame. So now what I'm going to do, and I will pass this around, I'm going to go back to the original that you're holding, someone is, and I'm going to see. Whoops. Okay, sorry about that. So I'm now going to play on my period instrument with what I think might be close to what Bach had imagined. And one thing that's important, and you might not have noticed it, when I played the modern editions, I almost played that bass note before the downbeat in order to fit it in. But now that I understand it's a bass line, I need to always put that bass note on the beat, and then I'm going to roll up for it. So instead of, so I'm going to try and play that opening on this violin. So you just heard I did those here. I'll try and get your ears back. So you heard me do before. So now we're going to try something very different. So sorry. So the idea of this is, again, trying to go back and forth and realize that there is really a separation, and the 18th century understood this, the difference between execution and expression. So and they're not inextricably tied to each other. And just to remember, my modern violin was made in 1702, before it was modernized. So that's a little bit what this game is. And I'm thinking that if it's okay with Bill, I'd like to come back and I will record the entire chaconne, which is about 20 minutes long. And we'll have that as a video that can be referred to if you take a look at this later on. Okay, so here's another copy of this if you want to look at it. All right, so
this
now
is great. We have a place to put them.
Yeah,
Just pass them out.
So now that we've talked about the importance of the bass, I think this is a really good time. I'm going to hand it over to Stephanie. We're going to move a little bit away from dance music, and she's going to talk about bass lines in general.
Right. Violinists like to think they're in charge, but in fact, they're not. We cellists are the ones that really control what is happening, and it's a lot of responsibility. So I thought it would be great to look at this cello treatise by Michel Corette, published in 1742. He wrote a lot of method books. Liz talked about the L'École d'Orphée, which is the violin method book that he wrote in part one.
Yeah.
He wrote a lot of method books, and I think he made a lot of money off of them, but I think he also knew what he was doing. The cello one is excellent. So these first few pages are just very simple. For those of you online, you can see all the T's and P's. Those are down bows and up bows. Tirer and pousser to pull and to push. So down bow, up bow. They're in first position. They look pretty easy. It's just a lot of repeating 8 notes. You might give them to your beginning students and then quickly move on as fast as you can. But there's a lot actually in these, and what's so great about them is they are examples of what a cellist in around 1740 would likely be doing, the kind of music that they would be playing. What I have here is I just have the bass line. I have no idea what the violin part might be. Somebody puts this in front of me and says, "Okay, let's make music." I think, "Oh my God, what's it going to be?" So I look at what I have as clues, and this is what I do in my process of playing a bass line. So first of all, it says largo, so broad. And I'm thinking, okay, it's a slow movement. It's probably going to be gorgeous. So my bow strokes are going to be something, something legato, as opposed to bright and sprightly if it were an allegro. That's pretty straightforward. It's written in 4, but I have, in each bar I have 4 Gs and then 4 Ds, then 4 B flats, then 4 Cs. So 2 groups of 4 in every bar, which also gives me a sense of cut time. So that's really something that I want to bring out. That's kind of my harmonic rhythm. The rhythm is moving in cut time, even though the meter is in 4 time. And Liz, I know, talked about the idea of a 4-bow gesture. When you have groups of notes, rather than playing individual notes that each get the same kind of accent, I want to think of all 4 of them as coming from one gesture, kind of like bouncing a ball. It just keeps bouncing on its own. So something, just to let it go. It's sort of like playing just one note, but giving it a reiteration so that it keeps sounding. So I'm just going to take you through my process as I look at this. So I start, I have 4 Gs, and then D. Oh, and that's kind of wonderful to express from the tonic into the dominant. There's this new bright sound, so I'm going to do that again. Now I start going somewhere. I sense a cadence coming, but I don't stay there. Keep going. Now I've come to something new. It's the second half of the phrase, and all of a sudden the motion, I change notes and it goes up and then it comes down, so I'm going to change the character of it as well. I'll go get into it. And there, with the repeated Ds, all of a sudden I have a quarter note orientation. So instead of going, I'm going to really give it to you, each beat. Oh, and I don't really cadence. I keep going. So just to do that last bit again, this is always one of my favorite parts where the actual cadence happens, but then there's a little trick and it keeps going. So I'll play the last 3 bars. And that is sort of what I'm thinking about when I play a bass line. Of course, I have no idea what's happening on the upper voice, but you have to start somewhere.
And after she does this, I never, when cellists say, oh, my part's really boring, all I have is 8 notes. It's not boring.
And I should have tuned my cello before I did that. Something where it has a similar kind of bass line, a lot of repeating 8 notes. But this time I have the violin part, and in 18th century scores for a continuo sonata like this, where there's just one treble voice, they would give you both parts, which really helps. It helps the violinist and it helps the bass to see that. Often when you're playing in an orchestra or you're playing something with more than 2 players, you don't get all that information. So I have something a little bit similar. I'll just walk you through it a little bit. So this, at first I'm moving more in quarter notes. I'm in the same key of G minor, and then I have some half bar expressions. So, oh, I liked that 3rd beat a lot. So I'm thinking strong downbeat, lighter 3rd beat, but then when the 3rd beat's so expressive, I'm going to give it something special. Now half bar. double bar and there's a little bit more, and all of a sudden we're in major, so I'm going to play in a little more sprightly way and see what that suggests to her.
Where the parameters of the expression are. So you may not be aware of it, but even though I have lots of different moving notes and they're clearly melodic, I am still only playing 2 big beats per bar. So in that opening, I'm playing, the first beat I'm playing, and the second beat is this. And the next measure, 1, that's 1 gesture. So again, this is a sonata by Eccles, and it's a really gorgeous melody.
Yeah, and I can be a force for good, or I can be a force for bad.
Oh yeah.
So we're gonna do a version. It's always tricky to play in a way that you don't believe in. And to do it with respect. So I'm gonna play all the correct notes, but I am not going to pay so much detail to my meter. I'm just gonna be steady, and
she's gonna play well.
I'm gonna play well, but I'm not gonna actively engage in that much thought.
She's playing 8 impulses per bar. And in a way, that's a little bit what I think I talked about when we group notes together. It's the same the way text groups letters together to make words and syllables. So it's as if she's pronouncing every letter of every word. And that makes me do that as well in the melody. And what really happens as the treble instrument, I now have to accompany that. So it's everything.
And it's I kind of played the bass line as if it were a melody, right? As if I were playing a melody, which is just not what the continuo line is.
But it's melodic.
It's melodic.
Which is different than it is the melody.
Right.
Yeah.
So this is a piece that has survived for some reason. I think Suzuki, perhaps, I might be wrong about this, liked it and put it in his books. And so it became a piece that everybody knows. It's written, obviously, for the violin. And some of the movements aren't actually written by Eccles. We know that some of the other movements, the second movement of this piece was written by Bonporti, and he happily put it in his sonata book and claimed it as his own. I think he maybe wrote the first movement, but we can't be sure given what he did with the second movement. But it's played on bass, it's played on viola, it's played on cello. And we have an example that we'll pass around, but those of you online can see it. We'll just do it afterwards.
Oh, that's right.
We'll pass around afterwards. And we're going to actually play.
So they turned the bass line into an accompaniment, which is really interesting. You can't see it in this room, but you can see that all those eighth notes are gone. The piano part has. So Stephanie's now going to take the modern cello, and I actually kind of love this version. But and that's the problem with this game, is because you say, well, Eccles wouldn't recognize this, but it's pretty cool anyway. So this is how this Eccles would have sounded. Do you want
that's the same piece. And it works because it's such a good melody, and so it survives this kind of treatment. But on the other hand, we're not learning the language that he was speaking when we do this.
And the thing is, these instruments didn't exist when Eccles wrote this, so you couldn't play your cello that way. The Baroque cello simply can't take that kind of tension. So the expression, in a way, because we've played this so much, even though she's playing with a very different modern language, her phrasing and expression is kind of exactly the same as the way I did it. You're still playing in half bars.
There's a lot in common. In fact, something that people often say to me is, "Oh, I like to play in a romantic way," and I think they mean 19th century romantic music. And I think, oh, but 18th century music is so romantic.
So I feel
it's so lush. It's a different quality of romanticism.
Yeah, I feel when we play together on the Baroque instruments, it feels, if I were to use that word romance and romantic, it feels like that to me. So, okay, we're now going to move to a piece, if anybody has ever had...
Here, you can see this modern edition.
Okay, so we're going to move to a piece that might be familiar to anybody.
Yeah, you had it right.
Oh, that's... who's had a child who's studied the violin with Suzuki. This is a very, very well-known, famous piece. It's a concerto by Vivaldi in A minor, and it actually shows up if you know who Suzuki was a great violin pedagogue, and he has a series of books. And this shows up in book 4, I think it is. And again, he found this music and did a little bit of that translation, the same way showed you with the solo Bach. And he's transcribed this and given me a lot of information, notated expressions. So what we've been talking about before, like in the Pursle and all those things that are not on the page, that's what we call unnotated expression. Here, as the 19th century went on, you get more and more what we call expressive markings, which are information of how to play this. So there's a lot on this page. He's given me, it's interesting, it starts with 4 notes together, which is similar to this bass line that Stephanie was showing us. And even though this is the solo melody, there's still a sense of those 4 notes. But I'm going to play it the way Mr. Suzuki has asked me to. I'm going to just play the opening.
Just go a little bit to the side so that they can see the music on the...
Oh.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Here we go. All right. So,
oh, wait, you're still in front of it. I don't know why.
Well, they're seeing this part up here.
Okay.
Okay. Notated in the mark, all those separate notes are showing me that I play up here with long tenuto notes and crescendos going forward. So I look at the original and we think about these 4-note groupings. It is in 4, but so many of these Baroque pieces that say they're in 4 have this what we call a la breve harmonic rhythm, which means that they have larger units. They're in 2. So the difference between what that really means, I just played in 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. I could play the same tempo, but just instead of 4 beats, I'm just going to do 1 large beats. So we're thinking in these larger units, and so instead of, again, it's that idea, instead of playing note by note, I'm going to be grouping those notes. So here, and that also will affect the tempo and the character. So it might be this. So here. Am I in front of the music again?
Yep.
Okay. All right. Very, very different character. And what this concerto turns into is almost like this kind of gypsy thing. Really, it's not really a concerto for children. So I'm going to show you one other excerpt, and then Stephanie's going to help me play through those 2 excerpts, but with our modern instruments, so you can see how we can translate that. So here's another excerpt, which is a little more complicated. Okay, we're going back to the modern violin, and so Mr. Suzuki has written over here, blocking, okay. Can you see it now? All right.
No, now you're worse.
What?
Yeah.
There.
Move that way, yes.
Oh, okay. No, I can't see the music. Okay. All right, so well, I'll try my best. I might play some wrong notes. These are hard. So this is what I see here in the music. And it's all, everything I'm doing is explained to me clearly by markings. Okay. Etc. Now, this is hard. It's very complicated in fast tempo, so clearly you're not supposed to play it too fast. Vivaldi actually did none of that. He just grouped all those together with slurs. And I talked about slurs last time. Slurs have this incredible effect in Baroque music. What they do is, instead of what we think of slurs as making a big old legato, they group notes together, so they create words out of a single gesture, usually defined by the first note. So here, again, we'll be in this other pitch, but these are exactly the same notes, but how Vivaldi actually notated it. Etc. So instead of my playing 16 notes and trying to make those 16 notes interesting as if I were to pronounce every single letter, it's grouped together, and each bar has really, and you can feel the harmonic moving, and that's how the long line is formed, because instead of trying to go through every note, I'm creating long lines the way sentences do, with different lengths and size syllables and words and punctuation. So actually now I'm going to ask Stephanie, so here it's not, again, the idea is that you don't actually have to have that period instrument to play that expression. So we're going to play those two examples again with our modern instruments. And
I think if you just turn more that way. Yeah, there you
go. Sorry, we're looking at this one.
I don't know how you ended up in front of it when you weren't before.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay, we're going to go all the way here.
Okay, so from the beginning.
Yeah. Oh, I'm blocking it again. So again, very different. Now we'll show you the other one, which is really fun. Okay. You know where it is? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. Okay. This is going to be challenging. Okay. Ready? And that's the concerto on modern. So that's the idea, is that that's with our modern instruments, with the expression that we learned from the period instruments. So that's kind of the end of our lecture part, and we thought we would just finish by playing a piece on our period instruments that we just love to play by a composer named Stradella. And we're going to take, so we can take this here. If you've got, I'm going to pass these all out so you can see this that we just did.
Stradella was a fun character. He ultimately died from being stabbed, I believe. And this was not the first attempt. It was I think the husband of one of his lovers who finally got him. And again, not the first attempt. One of the bad boys of the Baroque.
There's a lot of composers who kind of murdered that.
This is what's going on in the world today did not come out of nowhere. And it's this is in the Stilus Fantasticus style. It is for two instruments that aren't really designated necessarily. We don't know for sure that the second instrument was a cello. I have my doubts after playing it many times. it starts kind of in a very unmeasured way. You're not going to feel really what the rhythm is. It's very free, very a prelude. And then it becomes a little more rhythmic. Then there's a fugal section, and then a slow section and a kind of jig coming back to another slow section, and then sort of triple meter set of variations,
it's a
sort of minuet,
yeah.
like.
forgot to mention that if you want to make donations, please go to the Emerson Avenue Salons.com website. And I think there's a very clear button where you can do that. So that's, and then I hope you can all stay for, we're going to have an online reception, and I'm happy to take, actually before that, we're happy to try to leave some time for Q&A. So if there's anybody in the room here who has a question about what we're doing. Here, let me take this away. Any questions? How many people recognize that Vivaldi concerto? People online, I think.
It sounded like Vivaldi, but
Yeah.
I don't think I'd ever heard it before.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's hard not to recognize Vivaldi.
It always sounds the same.
It does. Very distinctive voice. In the same way that Bach is so distinctive. I think whenever you hear Bach, you know that it's Bach.
Well, we heard a Haydn today that did not sound like
No,
most of the
Haydn.
stuff.
Haydn is really different. It's already much later.
Right, but I'm saying
It didn't sound like Haydn.
it's not as, it was not typical of Haydn.
Oh.
At least that was my opinion.
What was it?
You remember one?
No.
No.
Well, okay, so do you want to try and go, are there people online who might want to do a question and answer online here?
Well, we'll switch to Zoom and
Okay.
Okay,
I'll give it a chance.
Okay.
good.
Saying goodbye.
Okay.
Goodbye.